Hello, welcome to Freedom Festival 2020. We're pleased you're joining us for our Freedom Talk Black Peril 2020 as part of this year's online Freedom Festival. Before we start, I just want to say that although this is a pre-recorded conversation, the speakers will be available after this talk from 2 till 3 p.m. on Twitter to answer questions and engage with you. Their Twitter handles are @Soweto Kinch and @Dr. Nicholas Evans, and we will share them again at the end. If you could also use the hashtag Freedom Festival 2020 and tag @Freedom Festival, that would be amazing. So my name is Marianne Lewsley-Stier, originally from Germany, as you probably can tell, but truly settled and feeling at home here in Hull. I'm the project manager for Black Peril 2020 and was formerly head of Culture Campus at the University of Hull, where I work closely with Nick Evans on events like this. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you to our guests. Soweto Kinch, brilliant British saxophonist who has won 2 Mobo Awards and been nominated for a Mercury Award. He has presented the BBC programme Jazzology on BBC4 and Jazz Now on Radio 3. He's also a poet and an Oxford graduate and is currently in the middle of editing footage for the Black Peril 2020 Arts Festival, taking place online from 14th to 18th of September. Visit soweto-kinch.com/Black Peril 2020 for tickets. Our other guest is Dr. Nicholas Evans, lecturer in diaspora history at the University of Hull and a member of the Queen's Anniversary Prize-winning Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation. Nick works closely with religious and ethnic minority groups at home and abroad, and through sharing his knowledge and research of their history empowers those groups. Some of his academic research on migration is on permanent display in museums in Antwerp, Cape Town, Hull, London, and Southampton. But enough introducing, let's hear what they have to say. So, Soweto, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about Black Peril 2020, the inspiration behind it, and why you have chosen it to do it this way?
Yeah, gladly. The Black Peril 2020 is an online festival. We've taken a really exciting group of dancers and musicians to a number of historic locations up and down Britain, up and down England and Wales. And 100 years ago, they were the actual scene of violent race riots. I was really inspired when I heard the story for the first time, realizing that there were even significantly large enough Black or Asian populations within Britain to have race riots, and had been thinking for some time about how to musically explore what that community might have sounded like, what they might have lived like, the excitement, the music, the dance that they would have done. And as part of that reconstruction, released the album Black Peril, which came out last year. I think in answer to your second part of your question, why have I chosen to do it in this way? Naturally, like a lot of musicians, a lot of gigs and festivals were cancelled in the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak. And not wanting to not only just not be depressed and think negatively about it all, but recognizing that we had something really unique in the cast of dancers and musicians that I put together the album release with. I thought, what better way to get deeper inside the subject matter, to be able to actually go to these places, even in the conditions of quarantine, and to create some sort of artistic intervention or commentary on this much forgotten history. And as I've begun to again scratch underneath the surface, so much more has come out. So yeah, in a nutshell, I'm just really excited to share all of this work and research with you.
That's great. And obviously one of the cities you visited was Hull. So Nicholas Evans, why don't you tell us a little bit about the race riots of 1919 in Hull and kind of maybe look at their contemporary resonance today?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marianne, and thanks, Soweto. The race riots, I guess, are one of the most forgotten moments in Hull's history. Hull is incredibly good at telling the world about its rich history, its rich maritime history, but it often forgets, it elides many players, particularly those who are of non-white origin, who are racially identified as Black particularly. We remember Wilberforce, we remember these freedom makers, but we forget horrible racist moments like the race riots which swept Britain between 1919 and 1920, but hit Hull and made Hull the epicenter for these race riots in June 1920. So what happened in these riots? These riots, these forgotten stories, which were documented at the time in newspapers, swept a part of Hull which many of us are familiar with, the Osborne Street area, just near the Paragon Station. So the heart, really, of modern Hull. And they swept a community, a transient community of black mariners who really stayed in Hull for a short period of time. And so really what was really ugly about this moment in Hull's history, this stain on Britain's national past, was that men, mariners, women who married people who of different races, especially, and also the children of those unions, were all victimized and vilified in a sustained series of events in June 1920. In 1919, preceding them, Hull had really introduced what was called by Jacqueline Jenkinson, a historian of this topic, a colour bar, and had stopped mariners legitimately earning a life at sea, having Hull as a home port. Mariners in fishery, mariners in long-distance trades. And in 1920, having been often deprived jobs from 1919 in this colour bar, they then were attacked for being black. And that really matters. We can't really hold back on this. This was ugly, this was painful, this was terrible. And this stain has been ignored. To make matters worse, we've celebrated Wilberforce, we've celebrated giving freedom, but at the same time, it's chosen to ignore, purposefully ignored this stain on the attacks. Women and children, particularly children, little kids who are even at infant school, were vilified and demonized in these attacks in 1920. There were not millions of people who suffered. I can't claim they were. But the handful of people who were particularly stigmatized in this were really suffering an injustice. I know this partly through my research, but especially because for what I found recently, my family were also implicated in this. They were seen as deviant, immoral, and degenerate. They were white, they were British, but they married a non-white mariner family. And through that, they were demonized as being debased, as being immoral, and being degenerate. And so what happened in 1920 in Hull matters to Hull, to the region, to the nation, to the world, because it's yet another episode of how the past has been distorted. The past has been elided. We need to remember it, going back to your point there, Marianne, because today when we hear about injustices in the world and we think, oh, that's something afar, that's not us, it's over there, it's those people, we forget that actually things like this happened in Hull too. In the place that we're often told was the birthplace of the abolitionist William Wilberforce, racism could sustain itself for a long period of time. Not everybody was racist. Most were thankfully tolerant. But we need to remember two things in my mind. One, that there was a sustained sizable black population in the city as early as the Elizabethan period, if not at birth in the Roman period. And they continue to the present day to augment and enhance the city. But two, that racism, that ugliness that we often think of as over there, in that place that's far away, can also demonize us. And so Soweto's choice to use music as a vehicle to communicate this story is visionary, but it's also important. It's timely as these Black Lives Matter debates sweep the world, that we remember here in Hull, Black Lives Matter here. In Hull in June, and also in July, we had Black Lives Matter gatherings in Hull, showing our solidarity. But I wonder how many people realised in the past, Hull didn't think Black Lives Matter. And in the Freedom Festival, that annual event where we celebrate culture and we use culture to remind people of freedom making, we need to remember of freedom taking, of the prejudice and the suffering and intolerance that people felt. I know I sound bitter, I am. I'm a Hull man, you can tell it with my accent. But we need to remember these stories to tell people so they're at least informed, and at least through information, they may stop it happening again. Because Hull has always had a black population, and we need at last to celebrate that in as many diverse ways as we can. And so that's all I really wanted to add on that we need to embrace this story to make sure this story matters.
Thank you so much. That was such an impassioned, description of why this history is so important, and it's triggering so many thoughts in me as well, so many resonances. And I'm thinking about the construction of iconography, of symbolism that says that a city has a particular identity. And even the Windrush and all of the celebrations around that sort of ignore this much longer Black presence that you described. It goes back to Roman garrisons in Yorkshire, that goes back, to the 19th century and of course the history we were talking about. And I think there's an inconvenience about remembering that fact, because it sort of goes against the grain of representing Black and brown people as aliens or as foreign to British culture. A lot of the working class communities that I visited throughout this festival seem to have more than their preponderance of flags and statues and other emblems of sort of white Britishness in a way. And I don't think that's accidental. But another embarrassing sort of corner of this history I wanted you to comment on. As a Black person, I'm reading about what happened, and a number of trade unions employed Black dockers, gangs of Black dockers, to go around beating up Chinese sailors. And the sort of mobilization of minorities to fight amongst each other is both something that's embarrassing then and something that's still happening now with the likes of Priti Patel and people with brown and Black people mobilizing anti-immigrant feeling. So, I wanted you to maybe comment or give me some more information about that, what you think about it.
Well, I think our heritage, that was very much a part of the debates in Bristol that swept this summer and dominated the story this summer. Many of people have said, well, that was fine in Hull. I heard this the other week. Somebody said, oh, we're fine in Hull because we've got a statue of Wilberforce. We've got a few of them. We're fine. We aren't. We've got a statue of a very rich, powerful man who was an MP, a very rich banker, and we've got statues to him. Great. Yeah, it was good that it was a Wilberforce stood up against the abolition of the slave trade and then slavery. But actually, we need to have statues that represent all Hull's people today. And we don't just have to remember those in the past, we need to remember those in the present. We need to remember people, men, and dare we say it as well, women, because there are very few statues to women. I don't know if there are any. I think there's one hidden away in the Guildhall, a bust of a woman. And that's quite strange when at least 50% of the population are female. And then when it comes to race, we need to remember too that there are no statues beyond a statue to Mahatma Gandhi of people of colour. And there was a statue of a Jewish man, which was erected a couple of years ago, but that was it. So the minorities which have actually led the city, the minorities which have enhanced the city's cultural offer, and the people who have all toiled too as working hands need to be remembered. I'm not proposing for a second we have millions of statues being erected. That'd be bonkers and actually reduce their value. But we do need to have a mature conversation about how we can possibly think about celebrating people. The City of Culture was very good. You saw the opening event. I don't know if you've ever seen any footage of that, Soweto, but it was very good. It included people like Clive Sullivan, one of the first Black captain of a British sporting team. It also included Fine Young Cannibals lead singer, who was an adopted son of Hull. But that was it, really. And so at least they did attempt in cultural ways to include different voices. But I think the main thing is we need to have role models. Whether role models are people who look at in statues, I'm not sure. But certainly we need to have ways in the city, in a city like Hull, which has always welcomed people, has celebrated freedom, has embraced the world in its claims. We need to make sure that everybody feels empowered and inspired. And that's why I'm particularly inspired by you. Hearing that introduction with Marianne, we've got someone who's won some major accolades, been nominated for the top prizes in British music. And I know you're probably going, oh my God, it's embarrassing. But actually, no, it isn't, because people need to look up to you, regardless of the colour of your skin. But sometimes because of the colour of your skin, to be empowered, so that if there is a young kid out there, whether it's a boy or a girl, whether it is of any colour, of any creed, of any hairstyle, or people of no hair like me, that they are inspired actually by you.
Sorry to interrupt, but it's just something so powerful in what you say, because as we started to shoot these pieces for the festival, I was really conscious of the desire to upshoot them, shoot them from a worm's eye position, and create sort of iconography of these dancers and musicians. We've got Tyrone Isaac Stewart, who's this multi-instrumentalist dancer and just physically impressive as a person, as well as Hannah Mbuya on tuba and Griffin Forbes Amos on trumpet. And the way that we shot them was very deliberately to have them statuesque, to create some sort of feeling of permanence. Even though, as you said, the communities that we're running were quite transient, the Black presence is one that's lasted. And in this current debate about statues and how we remember history, I think it's important to inject that into the debate. And also, it struck me that something really incendiary in the way the iconography, the heroes are revered or not revered. Because we like to imagine that women were given the right to vote because a nice chap in Parliament sort of conferred it upon them. Or, you know, the narrative, as you mentioned, of Wilberforce almost conferring freedom on the Africans without recognizing this was a dialogue, and Africans were constantly trying to free themselves almost from the second they were enslaved. And so to have these new historical icons, these new statues, isn't necessarily an objective act. It is in some ways, and should be a deliberately incendiary one, to say the people that you venerate aren't necessarily the ones that us as ordinary people do. And the agents of change, the agents of history, are very rarely actually people in pinstripe suits and nice, wealthy, commodious houses like Parliament. It's actually ordinary people pushing the dialogue and change forward.
But it's also, I think, the function of the media too. And I think that's also important, because when I was privileged enough to be able to be there when the statue of Cecil Rhodes was removed from the University of Cape Town, and the world's coverage focused on that statue being removed, they didn't see a plinth nearby where a beautiful black woman, South African, born after the fall of apartheid, stood as an alternative statue, a temporary one, and it actually showed us what she wanted to show off. She wanted to show African music, her music. She wanted to show her style in a particular respectful but also fashionable way. And she also wanted to show she was a strong young woman in the born free generation of South Africa. Fantastic, fantastic role model. And I film it, I show it to my students every year. It's never, ever been shown, I don't think, in British televisions. And that's because the world is fixated on the removal of a statue to a rich, powerful, problematic man from the past, and not the alternative proposed by that young, inspired woman who felt the need that she could offer that. And her physical presence, just like you're saying, you're positioning with your musicians, that they're looked up, so they are on this temporary pedestal.
Yeah.
That is fantastic, because it shows us they may be passing, they may be temporary, but actually for a moment, there's going to be somebody out there inspired who's listening on. And I think that's fantastic.
I'm still here, but I'm frozen temporarily.
Okay. Do you know what? Shall I pause?
I guess one of the things I wanted to ask Soweto was really what is the legacy really of your fantastic Black Peril production? Are there going to be people who will have the opportunity to perform after you've gone? Or will local regional musicians be involved so they can continue that story, really?
Great question. I mean, what I'd love to do is create this new platform, a new way to create and share work. As I said, it's been born of necessity of not having the sort of venue space and festival activity, touring activity that we had before. But it should absolutely, this history should be reflected on by local groups, local musicians, artists and poets, and they should have their own curated responses. I hope that what we've done in this process is to create new plinths, to turn Poston Gate and the back of the old merchant shipping's office into a stage, into something that's worthy of people actually coming to visit, even after lockdown, and witnessing performances live there. Yeah, I just think it's really important to start that dialogue and to keep it going. And I certainly will, with this platform, be wanting to invite other people to share content on it in the future. If it works, this is all quite trial and error for us as well. But, you know, I'm really excited.
In other cities that you've worked on, have they found any innovative ways of which to actually provide a platform that particular people of colour could actually, who are young and talented and musicians, can actually, follow your mantle and follow your example of being
I can't say that I've seen any direct examples of kindred projects and stuff starting up. I'm sure there are in other cities. But one thing that really strikes me as you're asking the question, as we visited Cardiff, Liverpool, and London in Docklands, almost every site confronted us with the fact that there's a great deal of shame in this country about acknowledging obviously uncomfortable truths, whether it's slavery in West India dock. You'd think that there was no such thing as slavery as you walked around it, just money came out of nowhere. Liverpool strikes me as well, and going back to our discussion of monuments, the fact that the monument to the murdered Charles Wootton is on the sort of back face, the end of a rock, the edge basically of the docks within Liverpool, doesn't have a pride of place, and you certainly wouldn't know it was there unless you went looking for it. It was a problematic way to honour him because you're basically honouring the murder weapon if you've got a plaque on a rock to a man who was stoned and drowned. And I think it's about engaging with that shame and really sort of moving it to one side and saying we've got to have the conversation. We've got to allow the conversation to be had and remove that sense of shame, because it's not that it was just a long time ago and doesn't matter, but if we don't talk about it, those ideas are merely festering. That's a problem, a concern that I have at this precise moment. When you're talking about numbers of 20 or, you know, Morel Piggott, for example, in Hull being chased by gangs of up to 4,000, 5,000 people, you think, well, we know what happened to Morel. What happened to the 5,000 people who went on to have kids and grandchildren in Hull? Those ideas are merely just diffused amongst the population. And unless we are more maybe proactive about having these conversations and creating these new stages, then the same history could repeat itself.
So there have been quite a few debates in the academic world about actually what is the utility of remembering particular flashpoints in history. And I think Black Lives Matters really adds to some of these debates. You know, all life, every day of the week matters rather than just 1 month, 1 year, one event. And particularly in Britain, they've questioned, is it useful to just remember Windrush, that 1948 year? Is it useful to remember 1807 or 1833 as an abolitionist moment? And so really, what do you think we could do? Do you think there should be a moment where we try and have, I don't know, a new statue to people, or there should be something indoctrinated into all spaces or all cities? You know, what can people do, communities who may be watching this, to actually make a permanent change without just erecting another statue?
Yeah, great question. And I don't necessarily have all the answers, but I think there are lots of exciting and incredible things that we should be looking at. You know, the fact that probably at the time of the race riots, jazz was a popular form of music, probably not even called jazz yet, but ragtime. People had an engagement with the culture of African Americans and Dixie, but didn't actually want to engage with Black people. And I think that's still a tension that exists today. So I think just in actually engaging with the art and performing it, getting out into spaces and creating sort of jam sessions in these performance spaces, as we're doing with Black Peril 2020, hopefully others in the future, where a dialogue is forced. I can't necessarily say what the outcome will be, but I think in forcing us to, as jazz makes virtue of, to collaborate with people from different backgrounds, different experiences, different ethnicities, and create and forge something new. That's the challenge, and I think it's one that will yield fruit in the future. In terms of, there are no quick fixes. That's the one thing I do. I want to be optimistic in this moment. I end up hitting my head against the fact that there are certain impasses, and we can't fast forward to utopia without sort of addressing, as I said, the shame and what to do with it.
And Soweto, I was going to ask you as well, you know, traveling across these different cities and actually performing in the spaces of previous race riots, how did that feel like? And kind of what were the responses of the people you encountered in those places, but as well the musicians and the dancers? How did that feel like? And what are your impressions from that?
Our experiences of touring in every city were both similar and different, you know, very unique and distinct, reflecting, you know, circumstances of each place and the history, I guess, and of course the cast of musicians. But the things that we had in common really, I find interesting. In every city, we found a street that was significant in the historical record that was still in a working class community. And in many instances, still with a diverse population. This is where the Eastern Europeans will arrive, or the you know, recent arrived migrants in the UK will go typically. And the thing that we found that was interesting to engage with was that people came out of their houses often just to listen to the music and to learn more. And we're fascinated because it struck us that performance art of a particular caliber doesn't hit them on their doorstep. Even with sort of well-patronized venues in their locum, people don't necessarily go out and engage with these sorts of art forms. So that was really interesting and striking. We had very little animosity, which is great, which is wonderful. Even with all this lively debates around statues and history, you might expect a few people to say, oh, you're doing a Black Lives Matter protest. There was nothing like that. Maybe a couple of sort of passive-aggressive exchanges with people who might have just been worried about social distancing. But that, I think, belies the nature of, again, British shame to stuff. It's quite easy to engage in this moment and say, oh, great, I love that you've got a Black Lives Matter event and it's cool, without really getting into how we're all implicated in the system. And I think if there is a ray of hope, it's the epiphany that I've had that, oh, this is why they present both Black people and Chinese people and communism as dangerous historically, and even in this present moment, because the power of people working together is so challenging to vested interest, could be so dynamic, and could yield us the sort of new world that we're looking for, that I think division sells, and it's a way of averting that new future from happening.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. Listening to you that, I was just thinking about the music, and I always remember the issue of racism in the 1990s, particularly towards Asians, when chicken tikka would become the #1 most popular food in Britain from 1993. Right. Yeah. And I was thinking there, when it's quite funny how that racism continues to permeate different spaces, even though music is of different people is embraced, and foods of people are embraced. And I just wondered, I'm not sure really, I just wonder,
I think an even bigger thing...
Can music, I guess, would be a philosophical question. Can music actually stop racism? Even if people love the music, can it actually stop people, or is this a problem for music, really, that it only...
It's a profound question I've reflected on for certainly the past decade, probably for most of my playing in music. Does music change things, or are we just reflecting changes in the world around us? And I think it doesn't have to be that way. It can go either way, essentially. If you take someone like Bix Beiderbecke, who at the outset of jazz would have had to cross all sorts of colour lines to be able to meet Louis Armstrong and to study under him and to play this music he was fascinated by. There were material sacrifices to being able to play that music, and it really mattered to him. I think, yeah, today that's not necessarily the case, where people can appropriate and borrow from culture without needing to make the same sort of personal sacrifices. And it's something that, and again, I'll flip back to you. I think that once you've played music at a particular level and invested yourself, you almost become family. You become blood brothers and sisters in that ensemble. And the way that, colour is basically irrelevant in that context, where you've got bonds that really transcend ethnicity. And I think familial bonds like that are the way that we're going to heal. I'm thinking, mindful of something you told me about your own family history that you discovered recently, going back to Wales and the Arab sailors and Hull. And perhaps that's the only way ultimately we fix these sort of prejudices, because tolerance isn't enough. Just to say you're sort of okay with people being there. But once somebody is connected to you through music, through art, through performance, and through blood bonds and family, I think you have a completely different engagement to this history and these ideas of race.
So do you think then that we need to have further examples by people of all colours and all races and nationalities in all genres of music? Because in particular, a lot of people are love jazz, others love more modern, contemporary forms of music that have people of colour who are exceptional champions and incredibly talented with them. Do you think there are some areas of music that actually need to catch up to the modern world and actually become more representative, to actually, not in terms of what they produce, but in terms of who is actually conducting or performing or being involved in those things? Does music need diversification? Yeah,
it's a broad question, and I think there are those maybe high cultural institutions, opera, ballet, orchestras that often effuse exclusion without wanting to, and there's a conversation there about representation and needing to see more virtuosity of colour. I think within the pop world as well, there's a long and complex, again, a frustration with wanting to sell and propagate black music, but not necessarily have black people front and centre in that. And that could be something that needs to be tackled in the future. But, you know, I'm hopeful. I think that music does contain within it sort of DNA to collaborate, as I said, to get towards issues that are far deeper than skin color and, you know, help us to imagine the sort of world that we want to live in.
So I guess a question for both you and Marianne, since Marianne's keeping particularly quiet there. It's not something I'm used to. I guess to both of you. Do you think then that Black Peril is, in a way, too late? Should Black Peril have been part of a city of culture in 2017? Should some aspect of that, should the City of Culture of itself encouraged purposefully a greater representation of non-white musicians? Because I don't remember, unless I'm being particularly thick, an especially large number of non-white musicians actually coming to Hull and performing. And it's, I think, you know, it's brilliant that Black Peril's coming. It's brilliant that some of the world class of Soweto's capability is here. But what are cities of culture doing wrong? Because a lot of the places you visit in Soweto have been British or European cities of culture. And I think, have we got an issue there that places like Hull, which has just been a city of culture, need to learn from, really, as we evaluate how effective those events can be?
That's a very, very interesting question. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to speak for all cities of culture. And I think, you know, equal representation should be at the heart of any kind of programming, and it shouldn't be specific on, you know, big cultural events. It should come naturally, and there should be equal representation. So, and I've been, just now when you mentioned it, I've been desperately trying to think of, you know, what the proportion was, and I can't actually say, but it probably isn't overwhelmingly positive. But just one thing I wanted to say as well, I think we should never forget that, you know, any project like this is also a celebration. It's a really celebration of, you know, Black power, of Black beauty, of kind of the musical talents. It's that. So I just wanted to say that. But Soweto, over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to come in and chime in before as well, in relation to where pop music or music in general might be. I think we're all as an audience going to be looking post-corona for statements of greater authenticity, whatever that looks like. Things that feel more sincere and genuine, rather than manufactured and sort of targeted at a particular demographic. And engaging with subjects like this, you know, we all have an engagement with this. And that's what I think is important to remember too. Yes, this is about celebrating Black history and Black culture, but this is a subject of British history. You know, as I said, there were thousands of people involved nefariously, but involved in the whole story. I think it's important for us to look for our authentic link into that, however that comes out. I think that will be an impact of COVID-19, that manufactured and sort of superficial statements about Britishness. Maybe not now, but certainly in a few months.
Yeah. It's a journey, isn't it? That's what it is. And I think as well, if you look at progress, and I think it's interesting what Coventry is doing. I think, Soweto, are you still here?
Yeah, it's just my connection is unstable.
Oh, great. Okay. That's really good. Yes, and actually, Nick, I think it's really interesting as well, because what I would like to hear from your perspective, you know, from an academic perspective, from a research perspective, and that connection between, you know, the research and the artistic output and how the two meet. And I know you've worked together with a lot of artists to kind of articulate your research through various mediums as well. So how do you find, you know, this engagement with Soweto, for example, and what does it do to your research, and how does that kind of deepen your understanding of what you do, kind of?
I think for me, Marianne, I'm in a very privileged position. I work in a Wilberforce Institute, you know, flagship institute at the University of Hull. It's great. I'm in Hull City Centre. I'm a Hull man. I get to meet loads of talented people, some of whom have the talent of Soweto. I think the main benefit for me of City of Culture and more recent debates with people has really been the diversity of people. You know, I was talking a few minutes ago to somebody of South Asian descent from Scotland. I was talking to people from London who are Caribbean descent, and work closely with a good friend who's a Ghanaian. And I think that's a great thing for me, but I think more people need that opportunity to work with people of all walks of life, but of all races as well. and to actually open your eyes. I think one of the things that changed me the most was living in Leicester, one of the largest non-white populations outside of India. And I think that was fantastic eye-opener for me, not just for the curries, but also for the culture and for the diversity, to have that empathy, really. And I think we need to, as academics, go beyond the academy. I think one of the problems for us as a university has been that we've got a great diversity on campus, which is fantastic, but the city don't often really realise that. And I think there needs to be greater synergies between cities and universities, but also that actually there need to be platforms through which more of the research can be given for free. You know, Soweto is doing this, working kindly with freedom to share information, share ideas and his work. Academics need to be given the opportunity to share their work for free. I give as much as I can for free online, but actually many publishers say, no, you can't give, I give too much away for free, you know. And so it's a big problem for me that a recent book I've got coming out on the legacy of slavery in the Caribbean, I wanted out for free, you know. But obviously the publishers won't let that happen, and that's one of the big problems, that then people who wish to engage with that work can't, because they, you know, there are huge financial burdens or barriers to actually stop them doing that. So I think academia's got a long way to go, Marianne. And I think as well, cities as well around the world need to embrace what Hull has, and that's the City Council invested in our institute. Our institute has invested in visiting cultural communities, and there's that great partnership. But other places need to borrow some of those examples and learn. They'll do it better than we do. But we all need to work from that. How do we do it? And how do we have a voice with people and ensure that our work can be inclusive, but also empowering to everyone? Because I think that's what you need to do. You need to make sure people can critically engage with your work, as well as just say, yeah, you're doing a good job. They need to actually go, no, you're wrong on that, and actually challenge you, because that's when we become bigger, better people, and have more inclusive debates.
Yeah. It's also something in the model of this work that, because I've done something called the Flyover Show in Birmingham for maybe a decade now, where we take over a motorway flyover, and we've had artists like Maxi Priest perform and Ernest Ranglin, and it's been great. But the one thing we wanted to avoid from the beginning was the idea of bussing in sort of well-funded or great artists to an area that doesn't necessarily feel that they own it. There's no ownership in it. And that does happen in some well-intentioned art projects, that people turn up with a cello and a saxophone and just do something that's not really connected to the community, and are really conscious in terms of the longevity of this project as well, and these ideas, that it's something, again, a dialogue that feels owned by the community. You know, it was something that I spoke actually with David Porter about quite some time ago, when I think even before I did the performance in 2017 at Freedom Festival, that there were new communities, new immigrant communities in Hull, and how were they integrating? Could culture and art be a way of bridging those sort of cultural gaps? And, you know, I think that's a conversation yet to still take forward. It's still one that's live, even when we find a vaccine, hopefully.
Yeah, isn't it? Because initially the project was going to incorporate those elements, but then COVID kind of got in the way, and it had to be reduced to just kind of dropping a few musicians into those cities, isn't it? Without being able.
Why we have outreach and what outreach looks like. It's forced us to sort of reimagine what outreach is, and that I think is an opportunity.
Sorry, I think your sound has gone again.
Oh.
You're back.
Yeah.
You're back. That's great. Yeah. So Soweto, I think that's a really interesting point about outreach and engagement with the local community, and how, this project kind of is a real opportunity to A, convey a message, A, engage people, B, work with universities, B, work with the local community. So yeah, it's amazing. So any future plans, keep us posted and informed.
Certainly. I hope it inspires other artists to do the same as well. Certainly that's something I'm saying. I hope this is a model that's replicated widely as well, because just in my locum, getting up and cycling and discovering canal pathways and parks that I didn't know were there, there's so much that we can do as artists, as creatives, to transform perceptions of our local environments, whether they feel that they're lacking in hope and joblessness, and that could be an even bigger issue going forward. or they just are pretty areas that we want to drag people to and make them see the world in a different way. Music and art are valuable tools in that project.
Okay. So what other things do you think need to happen in this country to really make a change and to move progress forward? And, you know, how do you see this project kind of helping this as well?
Great question. Like one could write a novel on what can we do to change. But I think just having this conversation is a starting point. I think a lot of the time we want to get to the end. What does the solution look like? What do the fixes look like? And, you know, we're at a point of uncovering uncomfortable truths. The only way we can heal is to give these wounds sunlight. The only way we can get over them is to start airing them and hopefully finding and building bridges through it.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, actually, isn't it? It is about building bridges. It is about communicating. It is about finding a new narrative and a new way of communicating. I think music, young musicians, being in those locations, engaging with the people that walk past, sharing something of their personal history and make it relevant to people. I think it's really important. It's like what Nick said at the beginning, is that people often point the finger somewhere else, isn't it? It's that understanding that, no, this actually took place here, you know, and as you, Soweto, said, your kind of grandparents might have been one of the 5,000. It's like, it's about facing that, but not in an accusatory tone, but in a nice and embracing way. And I think it's been...
Well, it's something I said to my jazz students often as well in master classes and stuff, when I'm encouraged or feel compelled to describe race in music. It's because if you have hang-ups about these things and you don't talk about them, the music doesn't sound good. I don't know how else to put it. You don't sound like an authentic jazz musician if you play with these sorts of hang-ups, or you're afraid of checking out African rhythms because you don't feel it, you connect with it for whatever reason. You know, a lot of these insecurities hold us back as human beings. That's my genuine belief. And I think if we want to have a more enjoyable community spirit, if we want to see new work and new art forms being developed, you know, we should embrace people power, for want of a better term. You know, we should embrace that if we're left to our own devices and if we actually have this conversation, it will be better than if we don't. That's my conclusion.
Picking up on your point as well, Soweto, I think thinking, moving on from the 2017 discussion that I mentioned earlier and picking up on your last point, we also need to try and get some of this music that people would like into different communities beyond the city centre, into the new places, whether they're the migrant communities that you mentioned, where some of these horrible events in the past took place, or to other places. Basically, they are often to economically deprived spaces in the city who do not feel loved. That's the region, the areas, and the people within it. And I think, you know, the space is unfortunate, and more people don't live in the spaces that you're actually going to be performing some of this fantastic music, because that type of music does need to reach hard to reach communities in different spaces for them to get on board too with this positive story of remembering a painful thing, but moving on and embracing music as a way of actually trying to remember this, but also to celebrate great qualities and great diverse achievements in different ways, really. And I think, to me, it'd be great if we can find through your Black Peril event that or events that actually different people in hard to reach parts of cities in equally deprived areas of Britain, so Salford, Cardiff, London, or its East End, and Hull, and all of these different places, they all have such similar messages that actually a lot of the people in those places feel hard done by. They feel actually they're suffering, and actually if they know about this story, that may change their attitudes, and they may have greater empathy.
Hugely. And it's that old adage, you can't be what you can't see, right? So if you haven't imagined that the bridge next door to where you live could be a stage and that people would buy tickets to see it, if you haven't seen that as an example, and countless others, then how do you know to have a go yourself? And I'm also mindful of, as you're talking, Nick, this sort of mobilization of a white working class, which I think is actually quite a recent phenomenon. You have to set me straight there. But I think the working class for most of my life was just the working class. until around 2000 odd, when they really wanted to cleave off what they saw as a disaffected male population in terms of voters. And it was about creating, confecting divisions within a working class that didn't exist before. Before that, and certainly in the 19th century, I've heard that eugenicists were describing things like the Cockney race, or certainly viewing working class white people as a distinct, almost phenotype. And I wondered if you had any opinion on that.
Poverty was the big issue. They viewed that as being something which you cultivated, not something which you couldn't get out of. And I think you're right. And I think that's the issue. One of the things I'd written was that parts of Hull were so poor that prejudice didn't often emerge really or erupt, because deprivation was something that transcended all colours, all creeds and all communities. And it's an issue that, if we look in the contemporary world, may not be the same today.
Yeah, it's something you end up stroking your chin thinking, well, how could natural allies, you'd imagine working class allies, who if they just unionized and campaigned collectively for better wages, how did they end up tearing each other limb from limb in the streets? Exactly. And was it just the power of the media, or did it light a tinderbox that had been building for some time? It's something I'm very mindful of, that there wasn't the panoply of social media and lots of different, digital TV channels to watch. But the headlines, certainly news writers at the time, seemed to have an even more pervasive and maybe negative influence.
It's a paradox, I guess, that in an information age, we're less informed than ever any point in our history. So it's
yeah, it's true. Oh, well, it's been amazing to hear both of your views and to hear you have a conversation together. And I'm sure our viewers could listen to you going on about this for ages, but they will have the opportunity to ask you questions and engage with you on Twitter with @Soweto Kinch and @Dr. Nicholas Evans. And just as a closing remark, if you both could kind of just come up with one kind of key message or thought for the Freedom Festival audience, considering that this is the weekend of Freedom Festival, with so many different resonances around freedom, it goes across so many different layers and into so many communities. So, Soweto, if I could ask you what you would like to, what the message would be for the Freedom Festival audience.
Sure. I think that music and art can be tremendously transformative and healing, and that's something we need in equal measure in this particular time, to both, pick us up out of our lockdown state, to imagine a world that we want to live in the future, and to heal from what we're talking about, to centuries of trauma, centuries of shame on both sides, and a way of, as I said, imagining the world as we want to see it in the future. I think music and art, and of course, Black Peril 2020 are key ways to do that.
Excellent, thank you. And Nick?
Yeah, I just think in this painful year we've gone through, I think we can embrace freedom to try something different, to embrace different ideas, embrace different identities, and try and forget for a short period of time the pain and the suffering we've all gone through, and just try and find something that's uplifting, because I think that's what we all need. It's been a very difficult year for everybody, and just use this opportunity, unique opportunity we have in Whole Freedom, to actually embrace some great talent and think about something positive, because we need that escapism to be buoyed into motivating to more positive things.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, both of you. And
I want to change my finishing statement now. It was just that's cool. Just joking. Yeah.
Great. And yes, don't forget that you can actually watch the whole content of the Online Arts Festival, 14th of 18th of September. Visit soweto-kinch.com/Black Peril 2020 to purchase tickets. Okay, thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you soon. Bye.
Thank you. That's all.